Okay, tax students, this is part 4 of our video lecture for chapter number 1, and the topic is dependents. Before we take a look at the rules, let's review what we've done on the tax form, the 1040 form. So we've learned in the previous video, we have to identify the taxpayer's filing status, one of these 5 different boxes. In the case of the head of household filing status and the qualifying widow or widower filing status, you would need to have a dependent being claimed on the tax return. Now, it is possible the dependent is going to be reported on another return, and our taxpayer here is going to be able to claim that same person to qualify for head of household or qualifying widow. If that's the case, if you're not going to report the dependent down here in this section, you need to write in the name of the dependent over here, okay, to make you eligible for the head of household and qualifying widow. But for most cases, when you qualify for head of household or qualifying widower, that person that makes you qualified, you're probably going to be claiming them down here as a dependent. Now, we talked about standard deduction before, and if you, the taxpayer up here, can be claimed as a dependent on someone else's return, or if you're filing a joint return with your spouse, and your spouse can be claimed as a dependent on somebody else's return. We learned that there's a reduced standard deduction formula you have to go through to calculate out the amount. Also, if you were born before this date or are legally blind or file a joint return, and again, your spouse is over age 65 or legally blind, we had learned that the standard deduction is increased for an additional amount. Now, if your dependent is blind or over age 65, you, again, the taxpayer, don't get any additional standard deduction for that. But the main reason why we want to claim dependents is that you get to deduct or claim a tax credit, yeah, or a tax credit over here. And you can see there's 2 different types of credits. One based upon whether your dependent is a qualifying child, and the other is based upon whether the dependent is a other qualifying relative. Of the 2, the child tax credit is better, it's larger than this other dependent credit. In either case, you would have to check off one of these 2 boxes for each dependent you're claiming. And then we would go through a calculation, probably we'll save it for chapter 7, to calculate out something called a child tax credit or other dependent credit that will help you offset the tax we've previously calculated. Also relatively new for 2020 and even 2021, because of the pandemic situation, the government is paying out something called economic impact payments or stimulus payments. And if you don't get the correct amount during the year and you didn't get the full amount, what you can do is claim the amount now as a recovery rebate credit. And this will be determined by the taxpayer and the dependents you'll be reporting on your return. Our textbook talks a little bit about this recovery rebate credit in chapter 1. In fact, the book was published kind of early, so it didn't pick up the second economic impact payment. It only talks about the first. In fact, now there's a third economic payment for 2021, and we'll probably cover all of that impact payments and related rebate credits in chapter 7 later on in the semester. So let's take a look at the rules of how we determine whether a person qualifies as dependent and if it's going to be for this qualifying child credit or other dependent credit. So again, we're going to determine whether the dependent is either a qualifying child, which is better, a bigger credit, than another qualifying relative. So the rule for qualifying child, you have to meet a bunch of different tests. The first test here is how is that dependent child related to the taxpayer? And of course, the most obvious one is to have the child be a son or daughter of the taxpayer. That's the most logical, yeah? People visualize. But it could also be a stepchild of one of the parents, one of the spouses in a joint return, or adopted kids. Here, sibling means either brother, yeah, brother or sister, not son or daughter, and could be a half brother or sister, or a step brother or sister. Yeah, as long as these children are younger than the taxpayer. Yeah, your brother or sister is younger than you the taxpayer, you would meet this relationship test. Also, here it mentions that descendants of these kids, of your son or daughter, of your brother or sister, would also meet the relationship test. So, what you're looking at are grandkids, grandchildren, and the descendants of brothers and sisters. These are your nephews and nieces who would meet this relationship test for our taxpayer. Foster children also qualify. Here it repeats that the children have to be younger than the taxpayer, yeah? Or these children cannot be older than the taxpayer unless that dependent child is permanently disabled. Then that person can be older than the taxpayer. Okay, that's the relationship test. The next test is called domicile, or sometimes they use the word residence test. The qualifying child has to have the same home. Here they call it the principal place of abode as the taxpayer. In other words, they have to be living with the taxpayer more than half the year. Not exactly half the year, it has to be more than half the year. So maybe the parents have joint custody and they say, oh, we share half the year with our kids, yeah? Well, that won't cut it because it has to be more than half the year to meet this domicile test. The next test is age of our qualifying child. The child has to be under 19 for the year. Once you hit the 19th birthday, you don't meet this age test anymore. But of course, we always have exceptions to the general rule. And the exception is if the dependent is under 24 and a full-time student. So you're talking about probably a college student being claimed by the parent or the taxpayer. And as long as that student hasn't reached age 24 during the year, you meet this test. Full-time is not really a student for the whole year. Here you can see it has to be at least full-time just for at least 5 months. So that would be probably one semester during the year, and then you consider it to be full-time for the whole year. The next test is called joint return test. And we're not talking about the return for the taxpayer. We're talking about the tax return for the child, for the qualifying child. And the general rule is that they should not file a joint return if they're married. Of course, always exceptions if each of the spouses here of the dependent and spouse would have zero taxes if they file by themselves separate returns, then it is permissible for them to file a joint return just for convenience purposes. But if filing a joint return for the child and his or her spouse reduces the taxes, then you don't meet this joint return test. They should file separate returns if you want to claim this child as a dependent. The next test is called citizen test. The child has to be a U.S. citizen or a resident of the United States. In other words, you don't have to be a citizen, but you have to be a resident, a so-called green card, yeah? Or a resident of Canada or a resident of Mexico. Okay, those neighboring countries to the continental US, yeah? Here it mentions also if you adopt a foreign child, you can meet the citizen test, citizen or residence test. And then the most logical test people think is the support test, but it's really not what most people think. Here it says self support. It's not the taxpayer supporting the child, it's whether the child is supporting him or herself for more than half of the support costs. Yeah, doesn't sound logical. It's not telling you whether the taxpayer supports the child. It's asking you whether if the child supports more than half of his or her own costs. Keeping in mind, support costs is when you pay out money to pay for the support of that child. It's not the same thing as earning income or collecting income. Yeah, income is something coming in. Support is money going out, and the two may not necessarily be the same. In other words, you earn income, but you don't spend it for support. Here it mentions that if the dependent child is a student receiving a scholarship, you can ignore that amount. It's not money being paid by the student to support him or herself. Okay? And you have to pay more than half of the cost. The taxpayer has to, sorry, I'm getting confused. The child cannot pay for more than half of their own costs. It doesn't say the parent has to pay for it, the taxpayer, yeah? As long as the child doesn't pay for his or her more than half of the support costs. Let's see. Here it mentions if the child meets the qualifications to be claimed as a dependent for more than one person. If that's true, if you have more than one person meeting all of these tests we've seen in the previous slides, then the taxpayers can agree among themselves who will claim the child. But if they cannot agree, then there's a tie-breaking test. If the people trying to claim the child as a dependent, only one of them is a parent, then the parent is going to be able to claim the child. Yeah, and the one that's not parents cannot claim them. If it's two or more parents contesting whether they want to claim the child, it's the parent that has the child living with them for the longer period during the year. Again, the parents can agree among themselves. The rules here on this slide only depend upon if they cannot agree who's going to claim the child. And if the people claiming the child are not parents, it's the person that has the highest adjusted gross income that can claim the child. Okay. Again, that's only if you cannot agree among taxpayers who already qualified to claim that one child. So here we have a situation like that. We have Owen, our dependent child. He lives in the same house as his mother, that's Leah, and also an aunt. Remember, both of them meet the relationship test, right? Child, let's see, son or nephew. They live in the same home for more than half the year. We assume Owen is not supporting himself. Owen is a citizen or a resident of the US. So here is the question now. Under what circumstances would Christina, the aunt, be able to claim Owen as a dependent? Well, if Leah doesn't claim Owen, remember Leah's the parent, she has first rights to claim Owen. Then if Leah doesn't claim Owen, then Christina can claim him. Now here, why might Leah, the aunt, and Christina agree among themselves to let Christina, the aunt, claim Owen? Well, at least for 2020, there may be and earlier years, there may be certain situations where the child tax credit is going to be larger for a person who has earned income or work income. I'm not sure if that's going to be true for 2021, yeah, but in previous years, it may be better for people who have larger income, earned income, to claim the child tax credit by claiming the dependent. And it's kind of mentioned over here in this paragraph. Let's move on to the second type of dependent called qualifying relative or other qualifying relative. You always test first whether that child is a qualifying child, as we've seen in the previous slides. And if not, then you test that child under this qualifying relatives, in addition to other relatives you may want to claim as dependents. So here we have a relationship test again. And in the previous relationships we saw for a qualifying child, it also counts as a relationship here for qualifying relative. But also, you can claim people that are ancestors. Here it says broad list of qualifying relatives. So now you're also looking at relationships that include your parent, your father and your mother, and their parents, your grandparents. Also, aunts and uncles can qualify to meet this relationship. What relationship that does not meet this test are cousins. We were able to claim brothers and sisters, right? Aunts and uncles now. But their children, your cousins, do not meet this relationship test unless they're a member of the same household as a taxpayer for the whole year. This could also be a non-blood, non-marital relation. Yeah, could even be your boyfriend or girlfriend here being a member of the same household, and you may be able to claim them as a other related dependent, meeting this test of a few other tests we'll see here. Okay, that's relationship tests. The next test is called income test or gross income. We didn't see this test for qualifying child. It only applies to qualifying relative. Here it says that the qualifying relative cannot have more than $4,300 of income. This is income subject to tax during the year. And this test is maybe one of the harder ones to meet because if your qualifying relative just has a part-time job, they can easily exceed earning $4,300 during the year. And that would disqualify them from being claimed as a dependent by our taxpayer. Keeping in mind again, income is what is being made, money coming in for our dependent, which is not the same as support. This is the next test that most people think that you only need to meet to claim a dependent, where our taxpayer pays for more than half of the cost to support that dependent. Of course, most people who earn income like this dependent here would spend it on themselves, right, for support. But if our taxpayer pays for more than that amount, half, then the taxpayer would meet this test. So let's say that our gross income test here, we didn't have a gross income test yet for qualifying child, the first type of dependent. Maybe that qualifying child makes millions of dollars, but as long as they don't spend it to support themselves, they would meet the support test for qualifying child. But here, if our dependent earns that millions of dollars, they easily exceed this 4,300, and you would be disqualified from claiming them as a other dependent. So again, you gotta pass the income test and the support test. Support now where the taxpayer supports the dependent. Like we've seen before, the dependent shouldn't file a joint return with a spouse unless it doesn't result in decreasing their taxes. So that maybe they should file separate returns. That's your dependent. And likewise, they have to be a U.S. citizen or a U.S. resident or resident of Canada or Mexico. Let's see, the taxpayer's child does not meet qualifying test, maybe meet the qualifying relative. Again, you always test first for qualifying child, And then if you don't meet it here, then maybe that child will fall under the qualifying relative test. So the more dependents you claim, the more tax credits you'll be able to claim. Again, there's two types of credits, one for qualifying child, which is better than the qualifying relative. And there's some limitations, some adjustments that we'll learn about for those credits when we cover Chapter 7 later on in the semester. Related to that is because of the pandemic situation, the government has been paying out to taxpayers, to residents, this so-called economic impact payment. And it can be increased if you have qualifying children. Here for $500 more for each child. This is only talking about in our textbook the first economic impact payment for the year 2020. There was a second economic impact payment, I believe $600 per taxpayer and per qualifying child. There's even a third economic impact payment, but that didn't happen until 2021. So it's not definitely not in our textbook. But we'll talk about those credits and possibly it being phased down, reduced based upon the taxpayer's income. And we'll cover that in Chapter 7. What is covered here in Chapter 1 is the topic of capital gains and losses briefly. But you know what? We're going to save this topic for, I believe, Chapter number 4 and get into a little bit more detail, yeah? So you don't really need to know the calculation of this gain or loss. Just be aware it's a type of income or deduction um, that's reported on the tax return. Let's review dependents by looking at an IRS publication. I showed you this IRS publication before. It's called 4012, yeah? When we're talking about filing status. But let's take a look at it again for dependents. This publication is used by volunteers in a program called VITA, Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Program. And if you're interested in being a VITA volunteer, I probably will make an announcement when I know more information for the coming tax season, maybe in October or November for filing 2021 tax returns. But this book, this publication 4012, is a good reference for everybody. So you can Google for it or have it linked in our Laulima resources, chapter resources folder. And the index here, the table of contents is clickable. So let's take a look for dependents. So here's the general rule for claiming a dependent. It mentions here that if you, the taxpayer, are a dependent of somebody else, then you cannot claim anybody as a dependent. In other words, dependents cannot claim dependents. Here it mentions that a married person who files joint and is a dependent, the dependent cannot be filing joint unless I mentioned before, it doesn't reduce the taxes of either spouse. Again, we're talking about the dependents filing a joint return here. And let's see, the dependent has to be a U.S. citizen or a resident of the U.S., Canada, or Mexico, or here it mentions a U.S. national. So you can see two columns here, yeah, for different tests. Here in the left-hand column are the tests for qualifying child. And you always use this test first, and if you don't meet it, then you move on to the qualifying relative test. So here again is number one test, the relationship test. Child, that's son or daughter, step children, foster children, adopted children, brother, sister, as long as they're younger than you, half-brothers, step-brothers, and descendants of all these people. That means grandkids, nieces and nephews. Okay, so that's the relationship test. And you can use these same relationship tests to also meet this qualifying relative. In addition to like parents, in other words, ancestors versus descendants over here. Yeah. So aunts and uncles over here. And again, what's not meeting the relationship test are cousins. In-laws will be over here, yeah, in the qualifying relative. And if you don't have a married or blood relationship for qualifying relative, that the dependent, if they live with the taxpayer the whole year, that would be an option to meet the relationship test. The age test just applies to qualifying child. Has to be under age 19 or a full-time student under age 24. Or here it mentions if the dependent is permanently disabled, doesn't matter what the age is. Again, no age test for a qualifying relative. And then let's see, child must live with you. So the domicile or residency test, the general rule is that the dependent has to live for more than half the year with our taxpayers. It is possible if you have parents trying to claim the child, and the child lives with one parent, but the other parent that doesn't live with the child wants to claim the child. That's an exception to having the child live with that non-custodial parent, and you'll be able to meet this test. Let's see. There's no residency test for qualifying relative. Here you can see there's an income test for qualifying relative. There is no income test for qualifying child. This child could make lots of money, but if your qualifying relative makes more, 4,300 or more, you're disqualified from being a qualifying relative. Keeping in mind this 4,300 is income subject to tax. So if our taxpayer receives tax-free income, many times Social Security will be tax-free. You don't count it toward this $4,300 limit. And here's the support tests, which are different. In the case of a qualifying child, it's whether the child supports him or herself for more than half of the costs. In the case of a qualifying relative, it's whether the taxpayer is paying for more than half of that dependent's support costs. The joint return test really applies to both, yeah? You probably shouldn't file a joint return. That's the dependent. Okay, so you can use this table to do a quick review of the two tests. But if you want to get even into more detail of all these tests, further down there's these tables. So here's a step-by-step rule for all dependents. And you can go through these questions and it tells you to move on to the next question or you're not qualifying. And then more specific for, this is qualifying child, I believe, yeah? Qualifying child and qualifying relative. And here's the rule for qualifying relatives. Yes, more detail. Okay, let's see. Let's stop here and make sure to read your textbook and then work on the homework assignments. I may have a couple more short videos for the homework assignments that are linked within the assignments itself. Yeah? So if you have questions, make sure to email me. Okay, talk to you later.